"Did you enjoy the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked, smiling as he reached for another slice of turkey. And I remember holding my fork in midair, staring at him across the Thanksgiving table as if he had just spoken a language I didn't understand. Because in that moment, I realized something was terribly wrong, something that had been wrong for a very long time. And I said the only truth I had, quietly, carefully. "What lake house?" And the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that subtle way air shifts before a storm, where no one says anything, but everyone feels it. And I saw it then, the brief flicker in Victoria's eyes before she turned her head, reaching for her glass like she hadn't heard a thing, like this was just another ordinary family dinner. And I sat there in my small rented apartment's worn dining chair, the same one I'd had for nearly 10 years now, listening to the hum of the refrigerator behind me and the distant sound of a neighbor's television through the thin walls, wondering how my life had come to this quiet, careful existence while my son sat across from me in a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly groceries, talking about a house I had never seen, never stepped foot in, never even heard of until that exact moment. And I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Not panic, not anger, but something colder, something clearer. Because for the past 2 years, I had been choosing between my medication and my heating bill during the winter, wrapping myself in extra blankets instead of turning up the thermostat, telling myself that this was just how things were now, that after my husband passed, life naturally became smaller, tighter, quieter, and I had accepted that. I truly had, because I raised my son to have more than I ever did. I wanted him to succeed, to build something bigger, something better, and he had done exactly that. Building a company from the ground up, traveling across the country, expanding into cities I had only seen on television. And I had been proud of him. Even as our phone calls became shorter, even as holidays became less frequent, even as I noticed that every time I asked about visiting, there was always something, a meeting, a trip, a reason that made sense on the surface. And now here he was, sitting at my table on Thanksgiving, asking me about a house he believed he had given me. And I watched his smile slowly fade as the silence stretched between us. And I could see it, the confusion, the calculation, the way his mind was already trying to fix something that didn't make sense. And beside him, Victoria shifted slightly in her seat, her posture still perfect, her expression composed, but her fingers tightening just enough around her napkin that I noticed. Because I notice everything now, I have learned to notice the small things, the things people think no one sees. And I set my fork down gently, keeping my voice steady. Because whatever this was, whatever had been happening without my knowledge, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer going to ignore it. I was no longer going to explain it away. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't confused. I was paying attention. I did not sleep much that night after they left, not because of anything that had been said out loud, but because of everything that had not been said, the silence between us echoing louder than any argument ever could. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I began to retrace the past 2 years piece by piece, slowly, carefully, the way you would assemble a puzzle when you are not entirely sure what the final picture is supposed to look like. And the more I thought about it, the less sense my life seemed to make, because I had accepted things I should have questioned. I had explained away things that now felt impossible to ignore, like the way my bank account had never changed, not once. Not even by a dollar I could not account for, despite my son believing he had been sending me $1,500 every month. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table just a few weeks earlier, holding a prescription bottle in one hand and my electric bill in the other, trying to decide which one mattered more that month, telling myself that this was just part of getting older, that it was normal to have to make these kinds of choices, that I should not burden my son with my problems when he already had so much responsibility on his shoulders. And I believed that. I truly did. Because that is what mothers do. We make things easier for our children even when it makes our own lives harder. And yet now, looking back, I could see the cracks, small at first, barely noticeable, like the time David had casually mentioned over the phone that he hoped I was enjoying the extra help each month. And I had laughed it off, assuming he meant something else, maybe the occasional gift card he sent during the holidays, or the groceries he insisted on ordering for me once when I had been sick. And I never asked for clarification because it did not feel necessary at the time, because I trusted that if he meant something important, he would say it clearly. And then there were the conversations that ended too quickly, the ones where Victoria would suddenly need him for something. Her voice always calm, always controlled, always appearing at just the right moment to redirect his attention, and I never thought much of it. Not then, because she was polite, always smiling, always speaking to me with that careful tone that sounded respectful on the surface, but never quite reached her eyes. And I told myself that maybe I was imagining things, that maybe the distance I felt was just the natural result of time and change. But now, lying there in the quiet darkness, I realized that distance had been managed, shaped, guided in ways I had not fully understood until now, and the thoughts settled over me slowly, not like a sudden realization, but like a shadow stretching across a room as the light fades, and I understood that whatever had happened with that house, whatever had happened with that money, it had not been an accident. It had not been a simple misunderstanding, and for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided, that someone had been standing between me and my own life, quietly, carefully, making decisions on my behalf without ever asking me. And I closed my eyes then, not to sleep, but to think, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that the truth does not reveal itself all at once. It unfolds slowly, for those who are patient enough to see it. The next morning felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that does not comfort but presses in from all sides. And I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at the same spot on the wall as I replayed every word from the night before, not searching for what was said, but for what had been hidden underneath it. And for the first time, I did not push the thoughts away. I let them settle. I let them take shape, because something inside me had shifted, something that refused to accept easy explanations anymore. And I reached for the small stack of mail I had set aside days earlier. Bills, advertisements, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested a missing house or a missing stream of money. And yet that was exactly the problem. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary, as if my life had been carefully kept within narrow limits, predictable, contained. And I realized then that I could not rely on memory alone. I needed facts, something solid, something that could not be dismissed as confusion or misunderstanding. So I stood up slowly, my joints stiff in that familiar way that comes with age, and walked to the corner where I kept my old file box, the one I had not opened in months, maybe longer, because there had never been a reason to, not until now. And as I knelt down and lifted the lid, a faint scent of paper and time rose up, bringing with it years of carefully kept records, receipts, statements, documents from a life that had once felt secure and structured. And I began sorting through them one by one, methodically, ignoring the ache in my knees, focusing only on the numbers, the dates, the patterns, and what I found was not dramatic at first, not shocking in the way stories often describe. It was subtle, almost disappointingly so, the absence of something rather than the presence of it. No unexplained deposits, no transfers I could not recognize, no indication that $1,500 had ever arrived in my account. Not once, not over the course of 2 years. And I sat back on the floor, a piece of paper still in my hand, feeling that same cold clarity from the night before settle deeper, because absence can be just as revealing as evidence, sometimes more so. And I thought about the way David had spoken, the certainty in his voice, the way he had not hesitated when he mentioned the monthly payments, and I knew then that he believed it, truly believed it, which meant the truth did not lie with him. And slowly, inevitably, my thoughts turned to Victoria, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of quiet focus I had not allowed myself before, because once you begin to notice patterns, they become impossible to ignore. The way she had always offered to handle paperwork, the way she had positioned herself between conversations, the way information seemed to pass through her before it ever reached me. And I placed the paper back into the box carefully, closing the lid with steady hands, because this was no longer about confusion. This was about understanding something that had been unfolding in front of me for far longer than I had realized. And as I stood up, I made a decision, not aloud. One, not something I needed to say out loud, but something firm and quiet and unshakable. I was not going to confront anyone yet. I was not going to ask questions that could be easily answered or dismissed. I was going to watch, to listen, to let the truth reveal itself fully, because whatever had been taken from me, It had not been done carelessly, and that meant uncovering it would require the same level of patience. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing by the window, watching the thin winter sunlight stretch across the parking lot below, noticing how ordinary everything looked, how nothing in the world outside had changed, even though something fundamental inside my own life clearly had. And I realized then that if I wanted to understand what had been happening, I needed to stop looking only at what was missing and start looking at what had been quietly rearranged around me. So I reached for my phone and scrolled through old messages, not searching for anything obvious, but for patterns, for small shifts in tone and timing. And it did not take long before those patterns began to emerge, subtle at first, like the way David's messages had gradually become shorter over the past 2 years, more efficient, more distant, often followed by a separate message from Victoria clarifying plans or confirming details as if she were managing the conversation itself. And I remembered times when I had tried to call him directly, only to have her answer instead, her voice always warm, always composed, explaining that he was in a meeting or traveling or simply unavailable at the moment, and I had accepted that because it sounded reasonable, because it fit the image of a busy life. But now, looking back, it felt less like coincidence and more like control. And I sat down slowly, holding the phone in my hands, recalling a specific afternoon nearly a year ago when I had asked David about updating my mailing address after I moved into this apartment, and he had assured me that everything was already taken care of, that I did not need to worry about any paperwork, that Victoria had handled it. And at the time, I had felt relieved, even grateful, because paperwork had always overwhelmed me. But now that memory settled differently, heavier, more deliberate. And I began to wonder how many other things had been handled without my knowledge, how many decisions had been made in my name without my consent. And the thought did not bring anger, not yet, but it did bring a sharp clarity that made everything else seem quieter, more focused, as if the noise of doubt had finally faded enough for me to see the structure underneath. And I stood up again, walking to the small desk in the corner where I kept my laptop, opening it slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that whatever I found next would not be easy to ignore. And as the screen lit up, I logged into my email account, scrolling through years of messages, confirmations, notifications, searching for anything connected to property, to transfers, to anything that might resemble what David believed he had arranged. And for a while, there was nothing, just the same routine correspondence I had always received, until I noticed a series of automated emails I had overlooked before, sent from a legal office I did not immediately recognize, their subject lines formal, almost easy to dismiss. And I opened one carefully, reading each word slowly, feeling that same cold awareness deepen as I realized that documents had indeed been processed, that actions had been taken, but the details did not match my reality. The address listed was not mine. The contact information did not belong to me. And yet my name appeared there, quiet and official, as if I had been part of something I had never agreed to. And I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, because now it was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of how carefully it had been done and who had ensured that I would never see it. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been avoiding, that this was not distance, this was not miscommunication, this was design, and whoever had designed it had assumed I would never look closely enough to understand it. I did not rush to call David after that, even though part of me wanted to hear his voice, to ask simple questions and see how he answered them. But I knew better than that, because questions give people time to prepare, and I needed something else now, something quieter, something that would show me the truth without warning. So instead, I picked up the phone and called the number listed at the bottom of one of those emails, the legal office that had sent documents bearing my name, but not my life. And when a receptionist answered, her tone polite and routine, I introduced myself slowly, carefully, giving my full name, spelling it out, letting it settle into the space between us before I asked if they had any records connected to me. And there was a brief pause, the sound of keys tapping in the background. And then she said yes. There were files, several of them, and something in my chest tightened, not in fear, but in recognition, as if I had just confirmed what I already knew. And she asked me to verify a few details, my date of birth, my previous address, and I answered each one calmly. even as I realized that the information they had on file was accurate enough to pass any basic check, accurate enough to appear legitimate. And then she mentioned a property, a lake house, transferred into my name nearly 2 years ago, maintained through a management account, taxes paid automatically, expenses handled without interruption, and I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the words, not reacting to them, just letting them settle, because hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that paper never could, and I asked, as evenly as I could, who had been listed as the primary contact for that account. And there was another pause, longer this time, followed by a slight shift in her tone, as if she sensed that this was no longer a routine inquiry. And then she read the name, Victoria Carter, and I did not respond immediately. I simply thanked her for the information, asked for copies of all related documents to be sent to my email, and ended the call without raising my voice, without asking another question, because I already had the answer I needed, and I sat there with the phone still in my hand, feeling that same quiet clarity settle into place, piece by piece, until the picture was no longer fragmented, no longer uncertain, but whole, complete, undeniable. And I thought about all the times I had doubted myself, all the times I had dismissed small inconsistencies as harmless, all the times I had chosen trust over suspicion, and I did not feel foolish, not anymore, because understanding does not arrive when you want it to. It arrives when you are ready to see it. And now I was, completely, and as I placed the phone down on the table, I realized that this was no longer about discovering what had been done. That part was finished. This was about what I would do next, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of relief, but of decision, because whatever had been taken from me had been done quietly, carefully, and I intended to respond in exactly the same way. I did not wait long before the documents arrived in my email, each file neatly labeled, each page carrying my name in a font that felt both familiar and distant, as if it belonged to someone who looked like me, but lived a completely different life. And I opened them one by one, taking my time, reading every line slowly, not because I struggled to understand, but because I wanted to be certain, absolutely certain, that what I was seeing was real, that it was not another misunderstanding waiting to be explained away, and the details were all there, the date of transfer, the property description, the maintenance account, even the signatures, and that was where I paused, because my name appeared at the bottom of several documents, signed in a way that looked almost correct at first glance, close enough that someone who did not know me would not question it. But I knew my own handwriting. I knew the way my hand moved across paper, the slight curve in certain letters, the pressure I applied without thinking, and this was not it. This was something practiced, something studied, something copied with just enough care to pass unnoticed, and I felt a stillness settle over me, deeper than anything I had felt so far, because this was no longer just about omission. This was about replacement, about someone stepping into my place without my knowledge, making decisions, signing documents, controlling assets that were meant for me. And I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the room surround me, not rushing to react, not letting the weight of it push me into anything careless, because I understood now that the person who had done this had relied on one thing above all else: my silence, my trust, my willingness to stay in the background and accept what I was given without question. And that realization did not hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified everything. It removed the last layer of doubt that might have held me back. And I thought about Victoria, about the precision of her actions, the consistency, the patience it must have taken to maintain this for 2 years without a single mistake visible on the surface, and I almost admired the discipline of it. Not the intention, never the intention, but the execution, because understanding your opponent is the first step to overcoming them. And I closed the last document carefully, placing my hands flat on the desk as I considered what came next, not in terms of confrontation, not yet, but in terms of control, because whatever had been built here had been built on the assumption that I would never step forward, never question, never disrupt the structure that had been created around me. And that assumption was the only weakness I needed. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small shift in perspective, not as someone trying to understand what had happened, but as someone deciding how it would end. And I reached for a pen, not to sign anything, but to begin making a list, names, dates, documents, connections, Because if there was one thing I had learned from a lifetime of quiet observation, it was that the truth, once uncovered, does not need to be forced. It only needs to be placed in the right light at the right time. And when that moment comes, it speaks for itself. I did not contact David that day or the day after, even though I knew that everything I had discovered involved him as much as it involved her, because I needed to understand not just what had been done, but how much he truly knew. And there is a difference between someone who is deceived and someone who chooses not to see. And I was not yet certain which one my son had become, so instead, I continued with my routine, quietly, deliberately, making no outward changes, answering his occasional messages with the same calm tone I had always used, asking simple questions about his work, his travel, his plans, and I watched how he responded, how quickly he replied, how often Victoria's presence seemed to shape the conversation even when she was not directly involved. And it became clearer with each passing day that he had been living inside a version of reality that had been carefully arranged for him, one where everything appeared complete, managed, and in order. And I wondered how many times he had asked about the house, how many times he had been reassured that everything was taken care of, how easily those answers must have satisfied him, because they came from someone he trusted, someone who stood beside him, spoke confidently, and filled in the spaces where questions might have formed. And I did not resent him for that. Not yet, because trust is not a weakness. It is something we are taught to give, especially within a family. And if there was blame to be placed, it would need to be placed carefully, with full understanding, not assumption. And so I chose patience again. But this time it was different. This time patience was not passive. It was active, intentional, guided by everything I had learned. And I began to prepare in ways that did not draw attention, organizing the documents I had received, printing copies, placing them into folders with precise labels, noting dates, cross-referencing information, building something structured and complete that could not be dismissed or explained away. And as I worked, I felt a shift inside myself, subtle but undeniable. The same hands that had once set dinner tables and folded laundry now moved with a different purpose, steadier, more focused, because this was no longer about survival. It was about clarity, about ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no confusion left to hide behind. And I thought about Victoria often during those days, not with anger, but with attention, replaying every interaction we had shared, every conversation, every polite smile. And I saw her differently now, not as someone distant or difficult, but as someone deliberate, someone who had understood exactly where to position herself, how to speak, when to step in, and when to remain silent. And that understanding did not intimidate me. It prepared me, because if she had built this situation carefully, then she would expect it to remain stable, predictable, unchallenged, and that expectation would be her greatest vulnerability. And as I closed the final folder and set it neatly on my desk, I realized that I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was shaping what would happen next, and that difference, that quiet shift in control, changed everything. I chose a Sunday afternoon to see them again, not because it was convenient, but because it was familiar, because routines have a way of lowering defenses, and I wanted everything to feel as normal as possible. So when I knocked on their front door, I carried nothing with me except a small box of pastries from a bakery down the street, the same kind I had brought countless times before. And when Victoria opened the door, her smile appeared instantly, polished and practiced, her eyes scanning me briefly as if measuring something she could not quite identify, and I returned the smile just as easily, stepping inside, letting the warmth of their home settle around me, noticing the subtle differences I might have ignored before, the new furniture, the carefully chosen decor, the quiet confidence of a space that reflected control and intention. And David greeted me from the living room, his expression softening in that familiar way that still reminded me of the boy he used to be. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt the pull of that memory, the instinct to protect, to preserve, to keep things simple, but I did not let it linger, because simplicity was what had allowed everything else to happen without question. And we sat together, talking about ordinary things, work, weather, plans for the holidays, nothing that would raise suspicion, nothing that would shift the tone of the afternoon. And I watched them both, carefully, not in an obvious way, but in the small pauses between sentences, The way Victoria would glance at David before he answered certain questions. The way she would subtly redirect topics that lingered too close to anything financial or logistical, and I noticed how natural it all seemed, how seamlessly she moved through the conversation, maintaining control without ever appearing to take it. And after some time, when the moment felt right, not forced, not abrupt, I set my cup down and looked at David, holding his gaze just long enough for him to understand that what I was about to say mattered, and I asked him a simple question, one that sounded almost casual. "Do you still have the paperwork for that property you mentioned?" And I saw it then, the immediate shift, not in him at first, but in her, the brief tightening of her posture, the slight pause before she reached for her drink, and David nodded, answering without hesitation, explaining that everything had been handled, that the documents were stored digitally, that there was no need to worry about any of it. And I listened, nodding as if that explanation satisfied me, as if it closed the question completely, and then I turned my attention to Victoria, meeting her eyes for just a moment longer than necessary, not challenging, not accusing, simply present. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, not a confrontation, not yet, but an awareness, a recognition that the ground beneath this carefully maintained structure was no longer as stable as it had been, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the conversation drift back to safer topics, allowing the afternoon to continue as if nothing had changed, because the most effective shifts are the ones that happen quietly, the ones that are felt long before they are seen. And as I left their house later that day, stepping out into the cool evening air, I knew that something had already begun, not in words, not in actions, but in understanding, and that was enough for now. That evening, after I returned to my apartment, I did not turn on the television or reach for a book the way I normally would. Instead, I sat at my desk and looked at the folder I had prepared, the one that now held everything I needed, every document, every detail, every quiet piece of truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 2 years, and I realized that there was nothing left to discover, nothing left to question. The uncertainty that had once clouded everything was gone, replaced by something far more steady, far more certain, and I understood that the next step was not about gathering more information. It was about timing, about choosing the moment when everything would be placed exactly where it needed to be, so that no explanation could soften it, no deflection could redirect it. And I thought about David, about the way he had looked at me that afternoon, open, unaware, still trusting in the version of reality he had been given, and I felt a quiet sadness settle in, not because of what had been taken from me, but because of what had been built around him without his knowledge. And I knew then that whatever happened next would not only reveal the truth, it would change something fundamental between all of us. And that was not something I approached lightly, but it was necessary, because truth, once seen clearly, cannot be ignored without cost. And I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found his name, pausing for just a moment before pressing call. And when he answered, his voice warm, familiar, I spoke calmly, asking if he and Victoria would be available to meet later that week, not at their house, not at mine, but somewhere neutral, somewhere where the conversation would not belong to any one person. And he agreed easily, without hesitation, suggesting a quiet restaurant we had visited years ago, a place that carried memories he likely assumed were still intact. And I accepted, letting the simplicity of the arrangement settle into place. Because sometimes the most significant moments begin in the most ordinary ways. And after the call ended, I placed the phone down carefully, my hands steady, my thoughts clear, and I looked once more at the folder on my desk, knowing that when I opened it again, it would not be for myself, it would be for them, for the truth to be seen, not explained, not argued, but simply laid out in a way that could not be undone. And I stood up, moving slowly through the quiet of my apartment, turning off the lights one by one, not because I was tired, but because everything that needed to be prepared was already in place. And as I paused by the window, looking out at the dim glow of the streetlights below, I allowed myself one final thought, not of doubt, not of hesitation, but of clarity, because they believed I had been confused, they believed I had not noticed, they believed I would continue to accept whatever version of reality was presented to me. And that belief, more than anything else, was what had allowed this to happen, and now, it would be the very thing that brought it to an end.